Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to the latest of our Risk Authority webinars. My name is Howard Passey, and I've been set the challenge of talking about how we go about identifying competent persons and suitable and appropriate systems for the premises that we occupy, the premises that we manage, or the premises that we own. Particular subjects taken on a degree of more importance since the fire at Grenfell, and probably more so since the publication of the report by Dame Judith Hackett has made a number of recommendations in terms of competencies and requirements moving forward, and I may just touch on some of those as we continue on. The document that's sort of prompted this particular webinar, you'll see there on your screen there, RC66 recommendations for sourcing fire safety products and services, and it's the content of that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about. And you'll see from the agenda that I've posted up on the right there, I'd like to talk about initially what the legislative drivers are for us doing things a certain way and getting things right, who and what responsibilities are carried by certain individuals, what competence means, and how we can define competence and what we can do to ensure that we get the right people doing the right stuff. Fire risk assessments and the requirements in terms of ensuring we have suitable and sufficient assessments and getting the right people to do that work for us. Also, I'd like to look at DSEAR assessments because I think they're also an issue that needs to be addressed. And then I'm going to look at accreditation and certification, look at certification bodies and their listings and what that means, a quick look at CE marking, standards and other sources of guidance, and then as I mentioned a few moments ago, just a quick look forward as to what the landscape might look like in a few years' time once the recommendations that Hackett has made have been realised, and certain other changes that we're likely to see have been implemented. But as I say, I'll come on to that in a few moments. So in terms of our legislation, what do we have to do? Well, it's very, very simple. In real terms, let's not kill anybody in a fire and let's not injure anyone in a fire. And in achieving that, we shouldn't be putting people at risk of death or serious injury. Of course, to achieve such things, we need to provide general fire precautions such as fire detection and alarm systems and emergency lighting and signage and training staff as well, and those sorts of things. We need to maintain those systems in good condition so that they'll work when we need them. We need to provide safety arrangements, so to understand exactly what to do in the event that the balloon goes up and a fire starts. And we need to keep records. Clearly, if you're going to do something, you should establish the fact that that's been done, because in the event that there is a problem, you want to be able to show that you've done what's right in terms of either legislative requirements on those from the various standards that we might refer to. And then lastly, to have competent people. And the legislation does require competence, but not in all circumstances, strangely. It requires competence in some areas, for example, use of portable firefighting equipment and effecting safe evacuation of the premises and providing support to the person in charge. However, as we'll see as we wander through, that it doesn't apply in every circumstance. So who carries responsibility? Well, there's a list of the bits of legislation that apply in general terms from a fire safety perspective across the UK. And you can see there that despite having different bits of legislation, there is a person responsible, all of whom have different titles, either the responsible person in England and Wales, duty holder in Scotland, or in Northern Ireland we have the appropriate person. It doesn't really matter in real terms what their title is, or which part of the country they're from or they're based in. The requirements in terms of ensuring safety are pretty much the same. Now, I'm using as an example the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, which applies in England and Wales, just to cover some of the key issues here. And firstly, just to try and establish who the responsible person is? Well, as it says here, the legislation says that in relation to a workplace, it's going to be the employer. And that will be the case in the vast majority of circumstances. There are other circumstances where a premises might not fall under that category, and there are some caveats there that just wrap up who would be responsible in those circumstances. But in general terms, we're talking about the employer that is the responsible person. So it's up to them to make sure that stuff gets done. Now, we might think of the responsible person as being an individual, and I think initially when the legislation was first drafted and implemented, that's how it was seen. However, we've been able to establish that that's not the case, and that the responsible person can be the organisation, i.e. the body corporate, board of directors, shareholders, whoever that might be. They may devolve responsibility to others, but in real terms, the responsible person will be the individual or individuals who can be shown to be accountable for ensuring safety on the premises. So that sounds quite straightforward, but then the legislation goes on to say that any duty that's imposed on the responsible person is also imposed on every person who has any level of control of the premises, but only as far as the matters relate to those areas that they have control over. So we could, for example, suggest that the catering manager in a commercial kitchen within a public space or within a private hotel, for example, they can be held responsible for those items and aspects that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis or on a week-to-week basis that ensure the safety of the people that are working there. And that may be induction training, it may be mentoring, but it may also be things like cleaning extract ductwork filters and those sorts of things. So responsibility can be passed down. To clarify, the legislation then says where a person has, by virtue of a contract or tenancy, an obligation with regard to the maintenance or repair of the premises, including anything in or on the premises, or the safety of the premises, that person is to be treated as somebody who has control to the extent that their obligation extends. So now we're talking about people who may be from outside of an organisation. Yes, okay, we may use subcontractors to manage our catering establishment, but we're now talking about individuals who come in to maintain and repair our premises, so contractors and the like, or others who are there to provide us with assistance in terms of ensuring the safety of the premises, such as a fire risk assessor, for example, or other people who come in to provide us some form of advice. So the net is quite wide, and we see in a number of circumstances now that prosecutions for individuals in circumstances where fire safety arrangements on premises have proved to be less than they should be, have extended from the responsible person, the organisation, the fire risk assessor, through to employees and those involved in maintenance and maintenance of premises. And I've got a few examples of those which I'll show you in a few moments. In terms of competence, life's a little more complicated, as if it's not already complicated. There's an image there of an individual who doesn't realise how incompetent he is at riding a bike, but is shortly to find out, sadly. But the concept is inherent in all safety legislation and regulations, but there are very few areas or very few places where we can find a clear definition of what that means. The legislation or regulations are often quite vague. A couple of examples here. The Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order provides a definition of a competent person as someone with sufficient training and experience. So, okay, training and experience, that makes sense. Or knowledge and other qualities. Quite what that means is very, very difficult to ascertain, you know, what those other qualities are likely to be. And knowledge of what? Clearly the area of the area that they're purporting to be competent in, but exactly how that knowledge was gained, other than through experience, which is already classified, it's difficult to say. The HSE defines competence as the ability to undertake responsibilities and to perform activities to a recognised standard on a regular basis, and say it's a combination of skills, experience and knowledge, which is not a million miles away from what the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order says. In terms of ensuring competence, though, it's a matter for the individual to make that decision as to whether they're competent or not. So a competent person should know and what their limits are and only work within their limits. So for example, I undertake fire risk assessments on a fairly regular basis and would suggest that I'm competent to look at most types of occupancies in terms of ensuring safety and understanding the requirements, regardless of whether we're talking about an office, a manufacturing environment, or some form of storage facility, for example. However, I recognise that I don't have the competence to do fire risk assessments in more higher risk areas such as petrochemical processing and those sorts of things. And that's part of the competence mix, understanding exactly what you can do and what you shouldn't be touching. But of course that works both ways, and it's important that the individuals who are responsible for appointing somebody to do something for them ensure that they're competent to do that. So there's an element of them requiring a degree of understanding of what competence is in order to ensure that they're picking the right people. And it's those sort of loopholes and those sorts of concerns, I suppose, that led to the development of RC66 to give end users an opportunity to, or a way of finding out what's right and what isn't, and how to make sure that they best cover themselves. So if you're going to appoint somebody to do the work, whether that be your fire risk assessment or whether it be maintain your fire alarm and detection system, emergency lighting systems, or maintain your portable firefighting equipment, you need to make a reasoned judgment as to whether the individual or the organisation are competent. But that needs to be based on evidence. You know, simply asking them, are you competent to do this? You're unlikely to get a straightforward answer. So you may have to dig a little bit deeper by asking the person or organisation to provide some evidence that they're competent to do what's expected of them. Hopefully, when you're searching for people, you're going to be looking for individuals that have some sort of third-party certification or recognition of some form, and we'll touch a little bit more on what that means in a little bit later, and exactly how we can go about finding competent fire risk assessors, how we can find competent companies and contractors to do work for us, and how we can find appropriate bits of kit and equipment which are suitable for use in the environment we want to use them. So, just to sum up, I suppose, in terms of competency, if you're involved in providing or maintenance or management of safety at any level, you share some liability for its usefulness and operation when it's needed in a fire. If it's your responsibility to ensure the safety of persons, or appoint an assessor, specify a system, appoint an installation contractor, then it's you're responsible for ensuring that they're competent to undertake that work. It's not a duty of care, it's not voluntary obligation, it's a legal obligation. The legislation drives us towards ensuring that. And if we don't do it, then the fallout can be quite significant. So, all very straightforward, right? Well, sadly not, as we recognise. Duties of the responsible person, one of them is that they must make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to which relevant persons are exposed in order that they can comply with the requirements of the regulatory reform fire safety order in ensuring that the appropriate general fire precautions are in place. So nowhere within that statement does it say that the person undertaking the fire risk assessment needs to be competent. It just says that you need to make a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, or a suitable and sufficient assessment. However, the only way of achieving that is going to be by using somebody competent to support you in that work, unless you're competent to do it yourself, which is not always the case, but very often can be. So in very simple terms, it's important that you're finding the right people to do this for you. That in so many occasions when we're working with clients, I see examples of enforcement notices that are applied by fire and rescue services, and those notices always start with the phrase, your fire risk assessment is deemed not to be suitable and sufficient, because it's only going to be suitable and sufficient at the moment it's written. And the moment anything changes, then within the premises, then the fire risk assessment needs to change with it. But if they find a circumstance where they think that the detection system isn't appropriate for the circumstances, or that you haven't been running evacuation drills, they're immediately going to draw your attention to the fact that your assessment isn't suitable and sufficient, and that will need to be addressed. It will also go on and explain why it's not suitable and sufficient, and maybe give you some options for remedying. But in real terms, you're just going to be told that your assessment's not suitable and sufficient. So, what does a fire risk assessment look like? Apologies for those of you who've seen this before. I've used it once or twice in other presentations, but that's a letter to London Fire Brigade from a clothing company, obviously in London. It says, "Dear Sir, I have inspected the building from top to bottom, and there is no fire risk in the premises." Now, sadly, that proved to be not the case when the clearly interest was piqued, and the enforcement team decided to pay them a visit, and these were the conditions they found when they arrived. Clearly, a significant fire risk, and either these rooms have been missed and hadn't been inspected, or alternatively the individual had no understanding of what's appropriate and what isn't. So that's not a good example. But in terms of understanding what we need to understand, or what the fire risk assessor needs to understand, there are a myriad of issues that need to be considered, not just in terms of the safety systems, examples of which you can see flashing up on the screen, or the construction of the building, but also in terms of the risks that exist on the premises. If I can get this to move on for me. So there's just a simple list. We need to understand construction products and methods, understand compartmentation and passive fire protection, fire doors and glazing, fire detection alarm systems, suppression systems, emergency lighting systems. And moving on from that, understanding what's required in terms of testing of fixed wiring and portable appliances, testing of gas installations, and planning evacuations and such like. So competencies are quite broad. They're not focused down on a single specific area, but are focused far more broadly on a whole raft of issues. And of course, this list doesn't consider understanding what the risks may be from woodworking, or from the use of oxyacetylene or other forms of compressed gases, or the storage of flammable liquids, for example. But all of those enter into that mix. There's a huge range of things that somebody needs to, or that individuals need to understand. But who needs to be competent? Well, we've already addressed the competent person, in that they need to ensure that they're appointing competent people, and they need to understand what they have to do that, and how to do it effectively. So there's a requirement for a degree of competency in that in that perspective. Also, buildings and systems designers, they need to be competent. Installers of systems, fire risk assessors, of course. And then within the teams on a premises, in-house maintenance staff and engineers understand what's required and how to go about it. Contractors that you might bring on to do particular pieces of maintenance or repair work. Telecoms engineers in terms of how to make good behind them to ensure that compartmentation standards are maintained. Contract cleaners to understand the risks that they may introduce during cleaning operations in terms of the chemicals that they're bringing in. And training providers, and that's something that quite often gets overlooked, but ensuring that your training provider is competent and provides your staff, and whether that be just in general induction training or fire warden training or whatever it is, that they have the competence to understand what you do as a business and provide competent delivery of the right information is very, very important. And then last but not least, staff need to be competent. Not in all of those things we've just looked back on, but certainly in terms of whatever their responsibilities are. Fire wardens in terms of how they support evacuation, and kitchen staff just as another example as to what actions to take in the event of a fire, and what to do to ensure that their premises remain safe, and that the kitchen is properly, and the facilities there are properly maintained. So again, it's very broad ranging. We can't point at specific individuals generally and just say, look, you deal with it all, because the responsibility matrix is quite wide and has a very broad remit and catch-all. Here's just an example. Passive fire protection is often installed by other trades, and we see the usual horror show of poor standards of fire stopping and installation in certain circumstances. So it's not just other trades. You know, I referred earlier to telecoms engineers and the damage that they might cause without repairing it afterwards. And here's just some examples of how follow-on trades might not be aware of the importance of maintaining compartmentation and continue to, you know, continue to do their thing without much consideration of the ongoing impacts of that. Or they might be installed by the well-meaning, albeit without the necessary competence. I'm sure we've all seen examples of where expanding foams are used, but as you recognise, they're only appropriate for use in certain circumstances. Checking the manufacturer's tests and technical specifications is really important when using them, because in most cases they've only been tested in certain configurations, i.e. with a certain type of substrate, concrete or masonry, maybe, and with certain types of pipe work or duct work or cabling. So a particular product might only work where you have masonry construction and you have a copper pipe running through the hole. It might not work if it's a plastic pipe or if you're passing it through a compartment wall made of plasterboard, for example. So it's really important that these things are checked. And similarly, they're no good for large gaps. They're there to fill very shallow and very narrow penetrations, and the moment you try to use them in larger openings, the standard of fire resistance drops away from often a claimed 120 minutes right down to next to nothing. So they need to be used very, very carefully. We also need to ensure that we're aware of how a building's put together. It's just a few examples of a modular constructed building being put together. In order to undertake an appropriate fire risk assessment, it's going to be important that you understand how this has been designed and how it's been constructed, and the risks that might be associated with it, such as are shown here, large voids and holes in construction, which will allow for fire to spread quite quickly. But just looking at the outside of a building and something that's, you know, that's finished and occupied, it's not always going to be obvious, and that's why it's important that the fire risk assessor is able to establish the nature of construction and understand the risks associated with that, if they're to suggest that they're competent to do the work for you. Similarly, structural insulated panels, we introduce a large volume of what is generally contained combustible material onto a premises, lots of different types of cellular plastics in use, all with different combustion profiles, but the vast majority will burn, give off nasty gases, and will spread fire. And as I said, in general terms, they're all enclosed. They're not exposed to flame or fire or ignition sources. But the moment that we start to tinker with the structure, as such as we see in the example on the screen at the moment, somebody chasing in for a light switch, then we immediately expose the combustible core. We reduce the degree of protection it has, and unless that issue is dealt with effectively through the use of an intumescent pocket before the switch is installed, then there is an opportunity for fire and fairly significant losses as a result. And then a last example, insulating concrete forms, is we're using a polystyrene type material to create formwork, which is subsequently filled with concrete to provide the load-bearing structure of a premises. But once again, we're introducing a lot of combustible material into a structure. You just see the section there, and here's just an example of the size and shape of premises that are being put together. Not seeing a lot of this sort of construction in the UK at the moment, apart from in Ireland. It's quite popular in the US and various other places, and popular because you can be quite flexible with the design in terms of what you want something to look like. But you know, could very much be argued that we're storing up problems for the future. But again, it's really important that the fire risk assessor understands how the premises have been put together, and that the owner and occupier of the premises understands the risks associated with the type of construction and the materials that it's made from, because again, the moment you start to tinker with a building like this, cutting holes into it is the moment that the combustible materials get exposed, and the potential for fire and fire spread increases quite significantly. And we've also changed the way we heat and cool our homes as well. This is an example of a solar thermal system installed on a gazebo at the BRE site, where they demonstrate these different types of technologies. I think they call it their innovations park. But you'll see, not only do we introduce different forms of technology, but far more significant volumes of services that may not be immediately obvious, which will involve punching more holes into buildings to make sure that we can run cables and services around. So it's important that we ensure that that we understand not just the construction methods, but any other systems that have been installed to heat and cool the premises. Just as an aside, we have a seminar running here on 26th of September on modern methods of construction post-Grenfell, just to look at what the likely implications of the Hackett review and the various other bits of work that are going on within Govern at the moment are going to have on the built environment, hopefully to explore some of the types of construction methods in a bit more detail, look at their pitfalls and pratfalls, have a look at existing guidance to see whether it's fit for purpose, consider how buildings with good sustainability credentials can be made more resilient or are tackling resilience, and look at those issues associated with ongoing maintenance. And you can book this directly through the FPA website if you're interested. But it would be nice to think, wouldn't it, that put a new building up and life is very, very simple for us, because somebody's designed the building in accordance with appropriate standards, and it's been constructed appropriately, and everything should be hunky-dory. Well, this is an example of just showing Longboat Quay in Dublin. Brand new building, as you can see, looks to be in reasonable nick. However, all wasn't what it was thought to be. It was a residential development. There were 299 apartments. The premises were occupied, but on review by the local fire and rescue services, it was found that there were a number of additional requirements and improvements needed, which included the installation of a smoke ventilation system, compartmentation of the common areas, and fire stopping in service voids linking the apartments. All issues which you would imagine would be absolutely fundamental to ensuring the safety of the premises, and would have been specified effectively during design and would have been installed competently during construction, but clearly not the case. The upshot was an estimated cost of 3.5 million euros to put those things right. So we can't rely on the fact that new build is good. And here's a couple of other examples, as I said I'd provide you earlier. Fire Risk Assessor given a prison sentence, which was suspended for 12 months, for providing a woefully inadequate fire risk assessment in their capacity as a private consultant, left elderly clients at risk of death or serious injury, and was fined £1,600 or told to pay £1,600 in cost. The company who commissioned the assessor pleaded guilty to failing to provide a suitable and sufficient assessment, sentenced over 4 counts of failing to comply with the legislation, fined £40,000 plus £15,000 in costs. An example of a fire system contractor convicted. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges of failing to maintain a system effectively in a care home, and failing to inform the owners that there were problems. Some of the deficiencies are just listed there. A blown fuse had been overridden with a piece of wire. Alarm silence and fault warning buzzers missing from the circuit board. Fault warning light in the front face of the panel had almost been covered by paint, so clearly unacceptable. Associated with that, the same incident, an employee was also prosecuted for failing to act or failing to undertake a search of the premises when the fire alarm sounded. Now, it's never particularly clear as to whether they've been trained effectively to undertake that search, whether they were able to do so given the staffing arrangements in place at the time, and whether the training any training they had been provided for had been given by competent persons. But the upshot was that one resident was killed. The individual was only fined £500 due to their lack of income. So things can go wrong very easily, and the responsibility net cast quite widely. There is a way of doing fire risk assessments. Although the government don't prescribe a particular approach, there is a publicly available specification similar to a British standard which is published. It's not a mandatory way of doing things, and in real terms it's only suitable for use by competent assessors. It uses what would appear to be a tick box type approach, but as always, the devil's in the detail, and the individual needs to be competent and needs to ensure that they record the right information. It's all described in the standard itself, but unless you understand what you're doing, you're not going to be able to complete the assessment effectively. But it's a well-recognised way of doing things that enforcing authorities are quite familiar with. Following the fire that happened at Lakanal House, the government were concerned about the competency of fire risk assessors on the basis that assessments had been undertaken and they clearly not identified some of the problems there. And a Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council was established with representatives from the great and good, the logos of whom are shown around the circle there. The council now forms part, or is an element of the Fire Sector Federation, and they produced a competency criteria for fire risk assessments, which is a document that can be freely downloaded from a number of locations on the internet. If you search for it, you'll find it quite simply. But in general terms, that lists those areas that an individual should be competent in. It'll be interesting to see how that is adopted or drawn into the work that's currently ongoing, looking at competencies across the fire and construction sectors following the Grenfell incident. But I'll touch on that in a moment. So there are competency criteria, but I just wanted to show you some numbers. There are well over 100 training providers offering fire risk assessment training. You Google search for fire risk assessment training and you'll find reams and reams and reams of organisations offering it. However, the training delivery is to varying standards, I think is the kindest way of putting it. As an organisation, the FPA has trained in the region of 800 fire risk assessors in the last 12 months, and we're just one provider. Now, we don't claim to make anybody competent. We're providing people with an opportunity to learn how to do a fire risk assessment, to understand the background information, and on certain courses they get an opportunity to do a practice assessment and one that's critiqued afterwards. But in no way, shape or form do we suggest we're making people competent. But the best way of identifying a competent fire risk assessor is through choosing somebody off one of the existing fire risk assessors registers, because they do exist. There are 4 principal assessors, one run by the Institution of Fire Engineers, one which is the FRAC scheme run by Warrington. There is a scheme operated by the Institute of Fire Safety Managers, and then there's also the BAFE SP 205 scheme. However, when you look at the current registrants on each of those schemes, you'll find the numbers are relatively low, certainly given the volumes of people that are being trained on an annual basis. The IFE have 235 registrants, the IFSM 45, but the IFSM will only register people who have successfully or successfully undertaken and shown to be accredited through a third-party certification scheme. So of those 45, they will either sit within the Warrington FRAX numbers or the BAFE SP 205 numbers that are shown there. So Warrington have 44 individuals and 4 companies who represent a total of 89 persons, and then within the BAFE SP 205 scheme there are 66 companies listed. So if you're looking for competent assessors, there are places to go. The Warrington scheme and the BAFE SP 205 scheme are both UCAS accredited, and we'll come on to looking at why that's important in a moment. The IFSM will only allow people onto their register who've been through an accredited system. The IFE scheme at the moment isn't UCAS accredited itself, but has the largest number of registrants taking place. This is just something I found on the internet, undertaking a very, very brief search, and it's a quote taken from a website of a very well respected national training organisation who everybody would recognise the name. it says this short course is for anyone who is to carry out fire risk assessments in the workplace. By the end of the course, you will be performing your own fire risk assessments with confidence. Doesn't necessarily say they're going to be suitable and sufficient, but at least it says you're going to be doing the assessments themselves. This will help you protect your staff and business as well as complying with the law. The course is followed by an online assessment which leads to an accredited qualification, confirming your knowledge and understanding of the fire risk assessment process. So there may be some differences there, that one point they're saying you can do it, and the next point they're saying that you'll understand the process. But hey ho. The one-day course, so you can become a competent fire risk assessor in one day if taken at one of their training venues, and can also be done online, and the cost is £295 plus a £38 assessment fee. Completely inappropriate. There's not a wax rat's chance in hell that an individual undertaking a one-day course on fire risk assessment will be competent to do fire risk assessments anywhere, apart from maybe in the most low risk of premises, no more than 1 or 2 rooms with numerous escape routes. And sadly, this is the kind of advertising and the kind of offerings that now exist out in the marketplace. So when looking for a fire risk assessor, make sure you go looking for somebody on the register. Make sure somebody else has had a look at these individuals for you to ensure that they're competent to do the work that you're expecting of them. Don't take a chance. The dangerous substances and explosive atmospheres regulations often get overlooked, but they're about legislation is about eliminating or reducing risks to safety from fire and explosive or other events arising from hazardous properties of dangerous substances. And there's a requirement under the legislation to do an assessment of the risks and to make sure that suitable precautions in place and appropriate training has been undertaken. Ordinarily, it applies to things like flammable liquids, highly flammable liquids, gases under pressure, and also explosive dusts. So there are requirements in circumstances where any of those things might be present to have ensured that an assessment has been undertaken to comply with this legislation. But there are a couple of issues which pertain in that respect, as of June 2015, the classification of diesel changed, and to cut a long story short, the CLP regulations changed the classification for the upper flash point of a flammable liquid from 55 degrees to 60 degrees C, and so as a result diesel and other fuel oils are now classed as flammable liquids. And so it may very much go under the radar that for those organisations that store and use diesel, for example, they have a requirement under this legislation to ensure they've done an assessment that ensures the safety of those working with it and those in the vicinity. Again, there's no official register, however, for DSEAR assessors, but the Royal Society of Chemistry has a director of consultants, some of whom undertake this sort of work. It's not straightforward work. It's not simple. There's an awful lot of regulation. There's an awful lot of guidance, and it can be quite complex for the uninitiated, and certainly not something that should be undertaken by somebody who isn't competent and doesn't understand the properties of the materials that they're dealing with or the risks associated with them. So it's very, very important that you ensure competent people are doing those assessments for you. So okay, moving on from fire risk assessment just for a while. Just wanted to talk about accreditation and certification, just firstly to establish what the differences are. UKAS is the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, and they provide independent accreditation of certification bodies. So they're checking the checkers. In real terms, they're looking to ensure that anybody that is certifying anything is doing so in an appropriate fashion and in a way that's going to ensure consistency and appropriateness of what they're undertaking. So you'll often find, certainly in all of the risk control documents that we produce through Risk Authority, that there is always reference to UKAS accredited third-party certification bodies. If they're not UKAS accredited, then the tendency would be to advise that you steer clear of them. So that's what UKAS is there to do. It accredits certification bodies, and it's those certification bodies that are undertaking the certifications of products and services, whether they be fire risk assessors, installers, or the products themselves. The phrase that's used is conformity assessment, but I think we understand it better as third-party certification. So standards are developed by certification bodies specific to an item, to a system, or the installation activity, or maybe even design in certain circumstances. And in addition to the standards that pertain to that particular product or system or behaviour, they generally require ISO 9001 accreditation or similar for the organisation that they're looking at. There are a number of certification bodies, but these are probably those that we're most familiar with within the fire arena. The Loss Prevention Certification Board, BBA, and the Certifier and Fire Risk schemes, which are run by Warrington, and have a look at each of those in a few moments. I suppose one of the more common ones is the LPCB certification schemes, and they publish online what they call Redbook Live, and it allows you to search through those products and those organisations that they have certified and what they've been certified for. And I've just extracted some of the information from the website. On the left-hand side, you'll see a consolidated list of the areas that they cover. So sprinkler, water spray and deluge systems, fire detection alarm products, cables, fixed firefighting systems, management systems, manual fire extinguishment, and just looking a little bit deeper at what their schemes are under installers, service and maintenance. You'll see on the right hand side in the red font a list of those schemes that pertain to those particular activities, the latest one being LPS 2084 for the inspection, cleaning and maintenance of ductwork systems, which certain risk authority members have been heavily involved in supporting the development of. So there you can search their listings, you can download a copy of their book, which they update on a regular basis, but it's a great source of products and services that have been certified by an accredited certification body, and these are the sorts of places we should be looking. The fire risk scheme that's run by Warrington is focused on products, and on the left there you'll see a list of the areas that they work in, and again you can find whole ranges of products under each of those headings on their website. A very simple search function there, and similarly for their certifier systems. This is about certain types of products and services that they offer. I'm just going to go back one step, because the fire risk scheme, rather than being necessarily focused on the systems, I understand that this is more about installation. So the fire risk deals with installation, and the certifier deals with products themselves, and that's where the differentiation exists. I also wanted to touch on CE marking, as I mentioned right at the start, because it's relatively straightforward, but it's easy to get caught out. It's very, very simply a manufacturer's declaration that the product complies with essential requirements of European health, safety and environmental legislation, and it indicates to a national government that the product may be legally placed on the market. That's simply what it's there for. It's a legal requirement for construction products, and that's primarily what the BBA look at in terms of their certification work. It's not a quality mark and doesn't necessarily relate to the functional performance of the product, just confirms it's been designed and tested in accordance with a particular recognised standard. Where life gets complicated is that the China export mark looks very, very similar to the CE mark. However, certainly in design terms, you can see that for the China export mark, the C and the E are far closer together than they would be for the CE mark itself. But it's important to check. Just because you see a CE mark, don't immediately assume that it's the conformity mark. It might simply be the China export mark, and it's worth checking that you've got you understand what is what. The BSI Kitemark is another mark that we often see. It's a voluntary mark that's used by manufacturers simply to demonstrate quality, safety and reliability. And the purpose of the mark is really just to confirm that whatever their product or service is. And predominantly in the fire market, we see the marks on portable fire extinguishing equipment and fire detection alarm systems and emergency lighting, that's been thoroughly tested and checked and shown to consistently meet the requirements of the appropriate standard. But again, it's not necessarily a conformity mark. We also have British standards, and the recommendation is that if you're going to install anything, or if you're going to undertake anything, always do so in accordance with the requirements of the standard, because although they're not necessarily seen as regulation, if you can't show that you have maintained a system, for example, in accordance with the British standard, then somebody will question whether that's been done appropriately, and you can be held liable in the event that there's a problem. So we always recommend that products and services are purchased that comply with the appropriate standard. And a couple of examples there: BSEAR 3 for portable fire extinguishers for their manufacture and performance, or BS 5839 Part 1 for fire detection alarm system installations. Certain organisations, however, multinational organisations, particularly those who may have a base in the US, may specify alternative standards. Quite commonly you see a specification for an NFPA or UL standards, and the logos are shown there on the scheme, on the screen. And invariably those standards will be commensurate with whatever we'd anticipate or whatever we'd expect in the UK. But you just have to be careful that you understand the nuanced differences between the two, because they aren't identical, and in certain circumstances it may be far more difficult to apply a US-based standard in the UK simply because of our service and infrastructure. However, in the absence that you can't find a standard, whether that be a British standard or whether that be something from another country, you should always be looking to reference codes of practice and recognised guidance documents that come from professional organisations such as Risk Authority, or another example, the Association of Specialist Fire Protection, who deal with passive fire safety products and services. Standards commonly refer to methods of testing of products to prove conformity. However, the one thing we must understand is that it's not just about the product's testing, but the use of the product in accordance with whatever those test parameters might be. So, as it says there, it's essential that products are used in precisely the same configuration as that in which they were testing, without any form of modification. Now, the most obvious example of this is fire doors. Fire doors are a piece of engineering. They're not two lumps of wood or a lump of wood that fill a hole, as our grandparents might try to advise us. But they're there to perform a particular function. They're there to prevent the passage of fire and smoke in the event of fire, and to protect escape routes, protect areas of high financial value or high risk, and they're tested in a certain configuration with the same closer, with particular ironmongery, with particular vision panels and glazing, and to use them in any other configuration means that you can't guarantee their performance, because they pass a test in one configuration and shouldn't be used differently. And I've seen in so many circumstances people will purchase a plain fire door and then decide that it's okay to put a vision panel in it without reference to a manufacturer, and that completely negates the safety that the door provides. As an example here, a photograph that was taken some years ago now wouldn't necessarily guarantee that that door is going to pass any particular test, but you'll see it's fitted with a particular piece of ironmongery, a red lamp bolt that I think we're all quite familiar with, the idea being that you use a little hammer to break the glass tube. However, in this case, the glass tube had been replaced by a copper tube, and that was done to stop people egressing through those doors on a regular basis, as they were doing, and using the appropriate routes. However, in the event of a fire, there's no way people are getting out of that safely. And any form of modification to a door can impact on its performance in a fire, whether that be a change of specification of intumescent seals, whether it be a different ironmongery configuration, or whether it be a different style of closer. So it's important to ensure that if we're using systems and products that have been tested to a standard or have been certified to a particular standard, they're used in exactly that configuration without any form of modification. So what if there are no standards? Made a reference earlier there to looking at what's available from other professional organisations such as Risk Authority, and just got some examples here. The HSE produce a lot of useful guidance that can reasonably be trusted. There's just an example there for lift trucks in potentially flammable atmospheres, albeit Risk Authority has its own version of that. The National Fire Chiefs Council, who used to be called Chief Fire Officers Association, they produce a range of guidance, this one most recently on fire safety in specialised housing. The Structural Timber Association produce widely recognised guidance that deals with ensuring the safety of a site in the event that you're using a timber frame construction method to protect other buildings that are being constructed, and also off-site risks. And there's just an example there of one of the colour type books that the ASFP produce, the purple book being on fire resisting partitions. The FPA and Risk Authority produce a whole raft of guidance, simple handbooks which explain issues in easy to understand terms and consolidate British standards down into something more manageable. And other organisations, trade associations similar to the ASFP, but this time the FIA, who produce a number of guidance documents on various aspects of fire safety, all of which are very useful and helpful. Now, for those of you who are engaged with Risk Authority, you'll be familiar with the risk control documents, the building design and management documents that we produce, and there's a couple of examples there. RC66 you've already seen, RC62, a relatively recent document that deals with photovoltaic panel installations. And similarly, within the security environment, there are a raft of documents which provide advice and guidance on ensuring the safety of premises and the safety of occupants from a security perspective. But we also produce other shorter pieces of advice. There's a risk control briefing note there on e-cigarettes, in particular the charging of them, for example. And all of this guidance is available to download free of charge from the free document library on the Risk Authority website. So that's most of what I have to say, really, in terms of ensuring competence, of making sure that you choose the right people and the right products, and how to go about doing that to protect yourselves, really, and to ensure the safety of your premises. But I did just want to take a quick look forward in terms of what various initiatives are like, how various initiatives are likely to impact. I'm sure you're all familiar with the front cover now of the independent review undertaken by Dame Judy Hackett and her team into the Grenfell fire. She's made a number of recommendations, one of which is to focus a new legislative regime on a similar basis to that of the construction design and management regulations, where there's a clear model of ownership and clearly defined responsibilities for individuals like the designer, the contractor, the client and the owner. And she's recommended that in addition to that, that the handover of information from one person to another, or from the contractor to the owner, should be more rigorous. We're aware that under building regulations there's a requirement to do that anyway, but it rarely happens. And that she's also recommended that this isn't just focused on work in high-risk residential buildings, but also to other multiple occupancy buildings where there's a significant life risk. There's just a list there of some of the areas that's highlighted in her report in terms of what clients and designers should be undertaking, and I won't go through that in any detail. You're free to pause that if you want and have a look at a little bit further if that suits you. But in terms of focusing down on competency, it's not just the big ticket items that she's targeted, but also some of those more niche areas, I suppose. And a couple of statements here: all those engaged at every stage of the life cycle of high-risk residential, high-rise residential buildings carrying out work that impacts on safety should have the proven competence to do so. So no longer just, competence is something airy-fairy, but they need to be able to prove they're competent. So that's going to impact quite significantly. It goes on to say hot work being temporary in nature means that it's likely to be carried out by those unqualified in fire safety or in an area that is not specifically designed with fire safety in mind, and goes on to make recommendations towards the use of a passport passport system. This is a passport system that the FPA as an organisation introduced a number of years ago for a particular retailer who are having significant problems with the volumes of fires caused by hot work during new build and refurbishment works. And it's been interesting to see that over the years, as their contractors and their managers have been trained to manage hot work effectively, the number of fires they're now seeing through hot work have diminished to nothing. And they require anybody coming into their premises to do work or to do hot work to have undertaken the course and have a valid certificate or passport to do it. So again, it's not just those broad and big ticket items that she's focused on, but also looked further down the chain at those maybe less high profile issues, but certainly those that we recognise as having a significant impact on safety, such as hot works management. A steering group has been developed under the industry, or a series of steering groups have been developed under the industry response group, called working groups, and they're looking at competence in a whole raft of areas, as you can see there, from engineers and installers through fire risk assessors right down to those supervising sites, managing projects, managing existing buildings, or working in procurement. And so what we anticipate will be a range of new competency criteria for all those involved in that kind of work, and potentially new qualifications for those individuals, which enable them to demonstrate their competence in those specific areas. So there's quite a sea change expected in the fire and construction markets moving forward as these initiatives start to develop and take bite. You may be aware the government announced yesterday a technical review of Part B of the building regulations, long overdue and something that Risk Authority and the FPA have been pushing for a number of years, sadly always fallen on deaf ears, and has just not been acted upon. Initially, the government decided that there was no need to technically review approved document B, and that something needed to be done simply to try and curtail the desktop review approach that was taken to ensuring the safety of a product, or conformity assessment in lieu of test, I think they call it in other phrases. But they have been convinced that a full review is required, and that work will start soon. You might also have seen that the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee, which is a committee supporting one of the government departments, have also produced their own report, and they've come up with a number of significant recommendations. They've called for a robust system of oversight, meaningful sanctions underpinned by strong prescriptive approach, and they should not be seen as mutually exclusive. So they don't think there's any need for doing away with prescriptive approaches, or alternatively focusing away from other forms of design which may be allowable, but they are expecting there to be better oversight and meaningful sanctions, as they say, for those involved in that programs, involved in that sort of work. It also says the government's intended ban on the use of materials which are not of limited combustibility in the cladding of new high-rise buildings must also apply to existing buildings, which is quite unusual, because invariably any changes that are made to building regulations or the guidance and standards is never applied retrospectively, but here they're expecting it, suggesting it should be, and that it should also be applied to other types of premises where there's a significant life risk. It's also concludes that where feasible, sprinklers should be retrofitted to all high-rise residential buildings and new builds, and that the government should make funding available for the installation where necessary. And it highlights conflicts of interest with fire and rescue authorities inspecting the work of their own commercial trading arms, or buildings appointing their own inspectors, and suggesting that something needs to be done to stop that happening. Suggests the reform should be rolled out to the whole of the construction industry, so not just focusing on a particular type of building, but being far broader than that across all construction work, and also suggests that the government should be providing loans to organisations to make remedial changes where they need to within the private sector to ensure the safety of the premises that people have recourse to. And that's just about it I hope it's not gone on too long, but I hope it's provided you with a bit of a steer towards how to find the right people, the right competent people, and how to find the most appropriate products for a particular scheme or project or piece of work that you're undertaking, and avoiding the pitfalls and pratfalls that there might be in just Google searching for somebody and picking the cheapest. It's important that we do this, not just because it's the right thing to do, and not just because it's keeping us out of jail, for example, but also just because we have a moral duty really to ensure that those that we're responsible are safe, whether that be in their homes or in their workplaces. As I mentioned earlier, you can download RC66 and all of the other risk control documents and other guidance that Risk Authority produce from the free download section of the Risk Authority website. And we do have some printed copies of RC66. If you've got any use for them, please just drop Dominic a line and I'm sure he'd be happy to forward them on to you. So thanks again for listening. Thank you.